Hi, everyone. Welcome. It's so good to see you on this sunshiny day, at least here in New York. If we haven't met before, my name is Rabbi Alyssa Mendelson, and I am the rabbi at Port Jewish Center here in Port Washington. And I'm thrilled to welcome you to our program this afternoon with Arial Sabar, who's an author and a journalist. A little bit about Mr. Sabar. He won the National Book Critics Circle Award for his debut book, My Father's Paradise, A Son's Search for His Jewish Past in Kurdish Iraq. His second book, Heart of the City, was called The Beguiling Romp by the New York Times, an engaging, moving, and lively read by the Toronto Star. And his Kindle single, The Outsider, The Life and Times of Roger Barker, was a best-selling nonfiction short. Ariel is also an award-winning journalist whose work has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Smithsonian Magazine, Harper's, The Washington Post. It's a long list, but lots of really great publications. He got his start at the LA Weekly, where he spent summers as a college intern, and later worked as a staff writer at the Providence Journal, Baltimore Sun, and Christian Science Monitor, where he covered the 2008 presidential campaigns. He has reported from Africa, Europe, Scandinavia, and the Middle East. He graduated magna cum laude from Brown University. He taught creative writing at George Washington University and has lectured about his books and magazine stories at Johns Hopkins, Georgetown, the Royal Geographical Society of London, Brown, and Yale, where he was a Poynter Fellow in journalism. He has been interviewed about his books and articles on NPR, PBS NewsHour, and the BBC World Service. And now, friends, he is here with us. How lucky are we? So he's here to talk about his book, Veritas, a Harvard professor, a con man, and the gospel of Jesus' wife. I'm sure you'd much rather hear from him than me. So I'm going to turn things over to you now, Ariel. Thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thank you so much, Rabbi Mendelson. It's a pleasure to speak to the Port Jewish Center and wherever else folks are turning in from. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you about this book. I'm going to start by reading a part of the book's prologue, because it really sort of like puts you right in the room at a key moment in the story, and a moment that will resonate in different ways as the rest of the book unfolds. So on September 18th, 2012, a group of international scholars gathered in a building across from the Vatican for an obscure academic conference on Egypt's earliest Christians. The week-long program looked much like those of years past, with highly specialized lectures on Egyptian linguistics, monastery libraries, and the wills of abbots. But at 7 o'clock that evening, the conference lost any semblance of the ordinary. A senior Harvard University professor rose to the lectern to make an astonishing announcement, one that a select group of journalists was at that very moment transmitting across the globe. She had discovered an ancient scrap of papyrus with the power to convulse the Roman Catholic Church. The professor, a 58-year-old historian named Karen King, was a well-known and deeply respected figure in the field of biblical studies. Harvard had recently promoted her to its Hollis Professorship of Divinity, the oldest endowed chair in America and one of the most prestigious posts in the study of Christianity. She was familiar to the public too, as a best-selling author and TV commentator on the first centuries of the faith. But the events of September 2012 would put her in a brighter and crueler spotlight than any she had known before. In a room overlooking the dome of St. Peter's Basilica, King told the audience of elite scholars that she had already given her discovery a name. Quote, "I dubbed it, just simply for reference purposes, the gospel of Jesus' wife," end quote. And so I'll stop there from reading from the book, but this fragment of ancient paper would make the network TV news and the front pages of the Boston Globe and the New York Times. It would inspire op-eds in the Wall Street Journal and Los Angeles Times, and bits by Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert on Comedy Central. Public reaction to it covered the waterfront. From conservatives, the devout, and the Holy See, there was dismissal, disbelief, and dismay. Among progressive Christians, there was excitement about the prospects of a more tolerant and egalitarian faith. Atheists saw it as one more piece of evidence that nothing in the Bible was believable. The hashtag Jesus wife lit up Twitter, and for some time, the world of biblical scholarship had no idea what had hit it. And there was good reason for all this uproar. Never before had an ancient text depicted a married Jesus. Tradition has long portrayed the central figure of Christianity as a celibate, lifelong bachelor whose only spouse, if one could call it that, was the church. But that wasn't the only reason for the drama. Its leading players were in many ways the very embodiments of reason and faith. On one side, you had Harvard, the richest and most powerful university in the world, a beacon of the Enlightenment and of prestigious impartial scholarship. On the other, you had the Roman Catholic Church, the richest and most powerful religious institution in the world, a place of spiritual mystery and cloistered intrigue. And so there on that fall day in 2012, when Dr. King made her announcement, they were quite literally staring each other down across a narrow cobblestone street, Via Paolo VI, named after a pope who vociferously defended the priestly right of celibacy and the exclusion of women from the priesthood. Now, my own interest in the story was something else beside. I had returned to it after that first explosion of publicity because I had actually been there from the very start. Smithsonian Magazine had gotten advance word of Dr. King's discovery. And in August 2012, the editors asked if I could drop everything and fly to Harvard. The magazine wanted me to interview Dr. King and then travel to Rome to be in the room, be in the room when she made her announcement to the world's top experts in the language and culture of Egypt's earliest Christians. And that meant I had gotten access to the protagonists earlier than any other journalist. I was part of the machinery that had helped introduce the papyrus into the world. And it turned out I would be the only journalist in the room beside the Vatican. I'd gotten sort of special access when Dr. King revealed her discovery to fellow scholars. And I think that's part of what fired this obsession with getting to the bottom of it, this need to know, this compulsion, really, that I think any serious journalist has to have, which is not just to report the news, but to run it to ground, to figure out if a story, particularly a sensational one told by a powerful institution, could withstand scrutiny. And in an era when the very idea of facts is under attack, I think that part of the journalistic calling is really important. But I had no idea what I was getting into when I decided to take this on. I had no sense of how twisted and upside down everything would become. Now, before I get much further, and because not everyone will remember the news coverage back in 2012, I want to set the stage a little bit better. Papyrus, for those who are not familiar with it, papyrus is an ancient predecessor to paper. It's where paper got its name. It's made from the pressed and sun-dried stalks of reeds that once flourished along the banks of the Nile. They're newer than clay tablets, but older than parchment. Papyrus was the predominant writing surface in the Mediterranean world at the dawn of Christianity. And this particular piece of papyrus is the size and shape of a business card. On its front side are 8 lines of handwritten text in Coptic, and Coptic is the language of Egypt's earliest Christians. And Coptic copies of the Gospels are among the oldest surviving copies in any language, and for a simple reason. Egypt is very dry. It's a land of vast deserts, and its arid climate preserved ancient texts that rainier parts of the world turned to mush. So it's not like Egypt had sort of a monopoly on early Christian texts. It didn't, but the texts that did circulate in Egypt had a much better chance of surviving than texts that were more urban and wetter environments. Dr. King decided to call this fragment, quote, "The Gospel of Jesus' Wife." And that title is printed nowhere on the papyrus itself. And importantly, the rectangular fragment is missing all of its fragments, all of its margins. So it appears as if it's been broken off or been cut from the middle of some larger sheet of papyrus. Here's you probably see these online, but let me just, this is like blown up to many times its original size. But you can see it's missing all of its margins. It's sort of ragged. And if these characters look a bit like Greek, it's because Coptic is primarily made up of Greek characters, with about 6 extra Egyptian characters for sounds that Greek isn't really capable of making. So the idea is that this tiny fragment, the size of a business card, would have been broken off of some larger sheet that would have presumably been part of some still larger codex or book. And not only is this presumably larger codex missing, each of the surviving 8 lines of text is missing its beginning and end. And so, imagine if, say, 2,000 years from now, every copy of Pride and Prejudice or Huckleberry Finn, pick a book, had vanished, except for a small scrap of sentence fragments resected from the middle of a random page. You might be able to tell a little bit about maybe one part of the book, but it'd be very, very hard to sort of reconstruct the entire story. And yet the odd thing about the papyrus, this papyrus, was that for King, these randomly surviving sentence fragments formed a coherent story with beginning, middle, and end. In her interpretation, the 8 truncated lines were evidence of a previously unknown gospel. She knew that in the 2nd century AD, believers had hotly debated the role of marriage and sexuality in a properly Christian life. The gospel of Jesus' wife, she proposed, must have been a previously undocumented side, as she called it, in that debate. Here, it seemed, was a group of 2nd century Christians who not only approved of marriage, sex, and women's discipleship for themselves, but rooted their theology in the idea of a married Jesus. And Dr. King, was renowned for just this sort of work. She had risen to the top of her field by wresting meaning from Christianity's most cryptic and fragmentary texts. The papyrus, in her view, depicted a dialogue between Jesus and his disciples over the qualifications of Mary Magdalene to be his disciple. And the show-stopping line sits in the very center of the fragment and would make headlines the world over. It says simply this, quote, Jesus said to them, my wife. That's it. That's what the central line says. And the words that come directly after that sentence fragment are wholly unknown. But in her lecture at Rome, in her scholarly paper, and in news releases and YouTube videos circulated by Harvard, King presented the world a portrait of Jesus never before found in the ancient world. A man married to Mary Magdalene, a proud husband defending his wife against skeptics, questioning her worthiness as a disciple. A savior teaching the disciples that marriage on earth is a symbol of believers' reunion in the afterlife with their divine twins in a higher realm. And King suspected that this gospel of Jesus' wife must have been somehow suppressed in antiquity, perhaps because its message about Jesus' humanity and his sexuality and about Mary Magdalene's leadership was at odds with the politics of the church fathers as they courted support from the patriarchs of Rome. This gospel was perhaps simply too hot to handle at a time when Christianity cast a dim eye on the physical body and its earthly needs. Now, King reminded people that the New Testament Gospels tell us nothing about Jesus' marital status. They don't say that Jesus is married, nor do they say that he's a bachelor. This is a common misconception. You can try to look as hard as you want in the New Testament Gospels. There's nothing in there about Jesus' marital status. So there's this huge silence. There's this gap in which centuries of theologians, writers, and artists have sought to place their own interpretations, all the way up through Jesus Christ Superstar and The Last Temptation of Christ. They've all sought to sort of fill this silence in the New Testament story of Jesus. And to judge from the surviving evidence, it's only in the 2nd century AD that believers begin to portray Jesus as celibate. And that may have been nothing more than a matter of, marketing, to put it crudely. Remember that Jesus was a Jew. He launched his mission in the Galilee, and Jews were his original audience. Jews were, of course, pro-marriage, and in many respects, to use a modern term, sex positive. The God of the Hebrew Bible blesses couplehood. God commands his people to be fruitful and multiply, and the Torah reminds men of the mitzvah of onah, a sacred duty to satisfy their wives. And as rabbis would later write in the Talmud, quote, any man who has no wife lives without joy, without blessing, and without goodness. So there are sort of a lot of contextual reasons to presume that Jesus was married. It would have been so shocking if he weren't that one would think that, one of the gospel writers would have explicitly said so. Yet the Jews, of course, refused to accept Jesus as their Messiah. And by the 2nd century, Jesus' followers had begun to seek converts among groups with very different views about the body. His followers' new audience were Greco-Roman pagans, many of whom exalted a life of self-denial and who saw the flesh and its desires as corrupting. Some scholars argue that this 2nd century alchemy of Greek and Christian thought produced the figure of a wifeless Jesus. As one expert put it, quote, since Christianity was competing with other salvation cults, the degree of sexual repression in a particular area was somewhat determined by the practice of its leading local rival. Christians sometimes tried to gain status by outdoing pagans at asceticism, end quote. So to stamp Jesus as celibate, that is, was to make him more attractive to the Greeks. But might that have been a disservice to history? I mean, I'm conscious of speaking to a Jewish audience here, as a Jew myself. And the debate over whether the historical Jesus was married is also, to no small degree, a debate over Jesus's historical Jewishness. Did he marry, like no doubt every other Jewish rabbi of his day, or was he this kind of renegade bachelor? And it wouldn't have been a complete first. Let's remember that the priestly class of the Essenes, the Jewish sect thought to have written the Dead Sea Scrolls, were also said to be celibate. So there is some precedent for this among Jews, but it's very rare. For King, though, the papyrus mattered for reasons that really didn't have much to do with Judaism. For her, it wasn't even really that Jesus was married. What really compelled her was the seeming identity of Jesus's wife. King had devoted her career to recovering the lost voices of women in early Christianity, and none was more central to her scholarship than Mary Magdalene. The Gospels depict Mary Magdalene as one of Jesus's closest followers, an independently wealthy woman from the Galilee who follows him to Jerusalem, watches the crucifixion, and sets out to anoint his body with spices, and then, of course, discovers the empty tomb. Yet, for centuries, the Roman Catholic Church, and really much of Western culture, had falsely portrayed Magdalene as a repentant prostitute. And this is the most famous, everyone, when you think of Magdalene, they think, oh, repentant harlot. There's this very crude stereotype that has somehow become fixed in the Western imagination. And it's just, but it's nowhere. You won't find that at all in the Gospels. It was a conflation. It was a later conflation of several characters in the Gospels many centuries later. And so there was this false portrayal of Magdalene, and King had long lamented this deceitful and really stubbornly persistent depiction. And as she and other scholars have argued, it was a slander concocted by popes to silence a powerful female voice in the early church. And the words on this newfound papyrus, however fragmentary and incomplete, came as a kind of validation for the theories King had spent much of her life writing and talking about. They did nothing less than redeem Mary Magdalene twice over. And not only was she as fit as the male disciples to preach the good news, she was Jesus's wife, as beloved as she was human. And there were enough words on this tiny fragment to create real problems for the church. Priests, take a vow of celibacy, a vow of chastity, and make a promise of celibacy, as it's called, in imitation of a supposedly wifeless Jesus. And the church says it doesn't ordain women priests because Jesus chose no women for his very innermost circle. And these 8 partial lines of Coptic packed enough firepower to rattle, if not topple, these twin pillars of Catholic tradition. And it was perhaps no surprise that Harvard treated the papyrus like a cross between a deadly explosive and a priceless jewel. When I traveled to Harvard to see the fragment a few years ago, I discovered that none of the 400 million manuscripts in its collections enjoyed greater security. By arrangement with the papyrus's then anonymous owner, Harvard stored the fragment in Houghton Library, the most fortified and closely guarded of its 70 library buildings. Houghton houses the university's rarest books and manuscripts. The handwritten poems of Emily Dickinson, a Gutenberg Bible, illuminated medieval texts, ancient fragments of Plato, Thucydides, and Homer. Admission is highly restricted. Surveillance cameras stalk every inch of the reading room. Librarians use electronic wands to clock each time a manuscript changes hands. Nothing leaves the building. But only one manuscript in all of Houghton Library requires a full-time human minder, a librarian who literally babysits it, a kind of guard who sits at the elbow of any researcher lucky enough to be cleared to examine it. And that one manuscript was the Gospel of Jesus' wife. Now, even at the beginning, there was an unnerving sense among scholars that of every rank that something about the papyrus was off. Most of them could accept the possibility that some previously unknown group of Christians had believed in a Mary Jesus. That wasn't it. It was other things. It was the provocative title, the Gospel of Jesus' wife, that King gave the fragment. It was that in what was supposed to be a random fragment of incomplete lines, the phrase, Jesus said to them, my wife, appears dead center, as if on a billboard. It was the decision to unveil it beside the seat of the Roman Catholic Church. It was the almost made-for-TV tableau of Harvard versus the Vatican, of reason with a capital R dropping a bomb at the doorstep of faith. Now, I'm not sure how many people have read The Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown or seen the 2006 movie with Tom Hanks, but because the Da Vinci Code sold something like 80 million copies, I've no doubt most people have at least heard of it. In a nutshell, in the book, in the Da Vinci Code, a Harvard professor of religion discovers a Catholic conspiracy to bury evidence of Jesus' marriage to Mary Magdalene, a secret whose exposure would supposedly bring the church to its knees. The thriller's fictional Harvard professor finds an important clue to this long-suppressed secret by way of a cryptic message inscribed on a piece of papyrus. And so the question presented itself: was Karen King's papyrus an authentically ancient manuscript? Was it a freak case of life imitating art, or was something darker at play? And these were some of the questions I was left with after filing that first deadline story for Smithsonian Magazine in 2012. I didn't have time to pursue it further at the time. I'm a freelance journalist, and I had to move on. I had to take on different assignments on different subjects for other magazines. But those questions didn't go away. And in 2015, 3 years after my Smithsonian piece, I Googled around to see what had become of the Gospel of Jesus' wife. And I found that scientific tests that Dr. King had commissioned seemed to have found no signs of modern forgery. Among her backers was an illustrious NYU professor, considered one of the world's leading experts on papyrus, and a New Testament scholar at Princeton. Many of King's colleagues, liberal, conservative, everywhere in between, believed that something was amiss. Not so much the Da Vinci-esque content, but its bizarre handwriting, the grammatical errors, even the way the words were strung together. The partial lines of text in the Gospel of Jesus' wife, a scholar discovered, could be cleverly constructed by cutting phrases from an actual gospel, the Gospel of Thomas, and reassembling them to say something new, kind of like a kidnapper who fashions a ransom note from words snipped from different magazines. After 3 years, scholarly opinion had moved decidedly toward the idea that the fragment was a modern forgery, but still there was uncertainty. On academic blogs, debates raged over whether King had made a historic find or whether she had somehow wound up at the center of an audacious hoax. After spending some time catching up on the latest peer-reviewed journal articles, I noticed that a baffling question had yet to be answered. Where in the world did this papyrus come from? What was its provenance, its ownership history? Karen King had told reporters in 2012 that a private collector had given it to her, but she had refused to identify him. She said he wanted anonymity, and that she would respect his wishes. Where he lived, what he did for a living, King wouldn't say. And the farthest I'd gotten when I pressed while writing my piece for Smithsonian was that he was a complete stranger, a cipher, who emailed her out of the blue one day to say he had an interesting manuscript he'd like her to translate. His request for anonymity wasn't wholly unreasonable. Many private collectors don't like the public eye. But as a journalist, I knew that sources matter. When a complete stranger shows up in a newsroom with a sensational scoop, it's not enough just to vet the information. A diligent reporter will also investigate the source. Who are they? What's their history? How might they benefit from a particular piece of information becoming public? What ulterior motives might they have for wanting to remain anonymous? Do they have a record of being trustworthy? Is there anyone who can vouch for their bona fides? And so, the final source for this discovery was Dr. King, and she was an esteemed historian at Harvard, her reputation seemingly beyond reproach. But what about her source? Isn't a chain only as strong as its weakest link? So in the fall of 2015, in a dry spell between assignments, I decided to search for this anonymous collector to figure out who he was. If the truth about the Gospel of Jesus' wife was ever going to see daylight, I felt, the path to it lay in the shadows of this faceless man. But how to get to him? Despite appeals from journalists and her own colleagues, Dr. King would say nothing. This man, this private collector, had been so helpful to her. He had agreed to everything she'd asked that she felt duty-bound to respect his only real request, which was, don't name me. So there was this huge roadblock, bristling with barbed wire. And unlike some journalists setting out on an investigation, I had no court files or police records to work from. I had no sworn witness statements, no deep throat source who could hand me the whole story on a platter. I would have to fit together a puzzle whose thousands of pieces often felt deliberately scattered and hidden. The only thing I really had going for me at first was a wonderful editor at The Atlantic who believed that no matter how it ended, I'd have a wild detective story. And even if I found nothing, the hunt for answers to this crazy Gospel of Jesus' wife thing would be a tale worth telling. Now, I had no intention of setting the bar that low. When The Atlantic gives you an assignment, you don't want to come back empty-handed. But I was grateful when she told me to trust my instincts and follow the clues wherever they led. The fruits of that first investigation appeared in a story I wrote for The Atlantic in 2016. And now, after 2 additional years of full-time shoe leather reporting in multiple countries, multiple states across the United States, it led to this book, which sweeps far beyond the magazine story into worlds I had no idea existed. I traveled to 12 American states, to Germany, Italy, Norway, and Switzerland. I spent weeks in libraries squinting at small type in decades-old phone books, tracing the movements of characters whose lives spiraled through the story. I knocked on doors in small towns from Southwest Montana to Southern Germany, following leads from one house to the next. My path would eventually lead from the halls of the Vatican and Harvard to the headquarters of the East German Stasi, before winding back to rural Florida, where I discovered one of the most fascinating men I'd ever written about. On paper, Walter Fritz looked like an unremarkable local, 50 years old, married, RV owner, licensed to fish and hunt. But once I started digging and once he started talking, I found a man whose life bore a Da Vinci Code-like stamp long before Dan Brown had ever set pen to paper. I found a man both animated and seemingly scarred by the complex crosscurrents of sexuality and faith. The relationship he'd formed with Karen King was as enigmatic as his own life story. How did this complete stranger ensnare one of the world's leading historians of early Christianity, a woman who'd grown up tough in Montana cow country, a skeptic who prided herself on her ability to dismantle and to skewer the church's long list of fictions? How does he convince her to stake so much of her reputation on a manuscript that even she knew was suspect? And the usual story is one of con man and dupe, of deceiver and deceived, forger and fool. But the deeper I went, the more complicated the truth became, and the trickier the moral questions. If a truth is important enough, can one use a lie to advance it? Does a righteous end justify dishonest means? Veritas is a work of both investigative journalism and of narrative nonfiction. On its surface, it's a globe-straddling mystery, a true crime detective story at the crossroads of desire and faith. If I've succeeded, however, it will leave readers thinking about and wrestling with much larger questions about the slipperiness of truth, the seductions of belief, and the sometimes porous line between reason and faith. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to just want to open things up to questions. It's really an incredible story. I wanted to take our first question. You know who you are. I'm going straight to you, Marcella. So.
Sure. Now, I haven't read the book yet, but I definitely will be, because that whole period fascinates me. And you don't really say whether you strongly imply it's a fake or not, but I guess one of the issues that I was thinking about as you're talking is, if this was a fake and if this was done to put forward that truth, it is sort of equivalent to what the Catholic Church was doing at the time when the Gnostic Gospels were brutally suppressed. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that, and on, and what the likelihood is that there was actually a Gnostic Gospel out there that mentioned Jesus' wife.
Yeah, no, good question. And I purposely, I didn't want to give away too many spoilers. So you'll learn a lot more about whether scholars really decided it was a fake or not by reading the book, but I think you can tell where it's going. And I think what made this such a compelling, I mean, it's on the back of Jack. What made this such a compelling forgery is that there was such a rich, believable context for it, right? I mean, there were these other, early Christians, despite what the Catholic Church will tell you, early Christians were not a harmonious, unified group. They argued constantly over the meaning of Jesus's life and his teachings, and there's a lot of dispute and a lot of debate over what the church should be, and so there were many texts, some of them that didn't make the canon, that are not in the New Testament, and some of those are labeled Gnostic texts because they share kind of a common worldview. And one of the aspects of that worldview of the Gnostic text is that female figures are much more central, and these are authentic. The other Gnostic texts are thought to be authentic, legitimate texts. In fact, another one that folks might have remember hearing about not all that long ago was the so-called Gospel of Judas, which was presented by the National Geographic, involving many of the same Coptic scholars who decided the Gospel of Jesus' wife was a fake. They said no, the Judas is real. Jesus' wife is fake. So it's not that these, when some people think, well, of course scholars will dismiss this, or biblical scholars will dismiss this because they're all Orthodox Christians or they're all evangelical. That's just not true. It's not so much that the message was intolerable. It was that that the handwriting, there was no ancient precedent for the handwriting. There were no fewer than 4 basic grammatical errors in a papyrus the size of a business card. It was the fact that you could reconstruct the language on the papyrus by cutting and pasting from other texts. But I think what made it a compelling forgery, and what all good con artists will do, is they will summon a very believable context for their fake. It's not a fake that's coming out of left field. It's a fake that actually hits a lot of buttons that are true. Yes, women did have more bigger roles in the Gnostic Gospels. Mary Magdalene was one of the leading figures of early Christianity in the Gnostic Gospel. So you take what people already believe, and then you add just another 15%, and that's exactly what made this forgery so successful.
So how has Professor King reacted to the book and your discoveries?
The short answer is that she hasn't. Well, after the Atlantic story so we had a very good relationship while I was working on the piece for the Smithsonian Magazine in 2012, because it was a big feature about her discovery, and we talked at length. I have hours and hours of interviews with her, much of which I was able to use in the book and in the story. But when I came back and I revisited the story in 2016 for the Atlantic and started investigating provenance, trying to figure out who the long anonymous owner of the papyrus was, and when I figured it out, I started learning all these things about his background that would have raised a ton of red flags had anyone known about them. There's a lot, but he worked at the Stasi Museum in Berlin. He had flunked out of an Egyptology program in Berlin after failing to really master it. He thought he was going to be a great Egyptologist, but he struggled with Coptic. It was like the same language that he didn't get right on the thing. And then he moves to Florida, and he becomes an internet pornographer in a genre of porn that features his own wife as a kind of spiritual figure. So there's a lot of weird stuff that's going on that I thought, I would go to Dr. King and say, look, I found some things out. I'd love to meet with you before the Atlantic story comes out, and just to see whether the things I found out would affect your belief in its authenticity or not. Can we schedule a time to talk? And she said, I don't see the point of a conversation. And she said she wasn't interested. She would read the story when it came out, and that was it. So a lot of scholars found that really bizarre, because as a historian, if a journalist who you previously found credible approaches you with information, when you at least want to know so that you can comment for the story, was not interested. After the story came out, she did call me up, and the day after, and because I emailed her a link to the story, and I said, I'm still interested in what you think, and I'd love to be able to report on how your views might have changed. She called me up and she said, I read your story. I didn't know a lot of these things. I now believe the Gospel of Jesus' wife is a fake. And that actually, her reversal was, because she was the lone holdout, her reversal was big enough news that it made the front page of the Boston Globe. So it was just to give you a sense of how big the story was at the time. And then for the book, I'm as a journalist, I really pride myself on being open-minded. I don't have a dog in the fight. If you shout at me, if you curse me, I will still come to you and graciously ask for your opinion, because it's not about me. It's about making sure that you are accurately and fairly representing the story I'm telling. And I wrote to her as soon as I got the book contract. I wrote to her multiple times after I called her. She just was not interested in taking part in the book. And that's her right. She was right not to do that. But I also think, and so that actually made me, rather than exclude her from the book, it made me sort of work twice as hard to try to make sure that I talked to as many people around her as I could to understand her part of the story. And so, yeah.
So in the book, do you talk about the consequences to her of admitting that it's, or agreeing, or I can't think of the right verb, but that it's a fake?
Yeah, I mean, the fallout, that's the weird thing, is that Harvard has really closed ranks around this. I mean, I know from my sources that this was a deeply humiliating episode for the Harvard Divinity School. Very, very embarrassing. This is not what they expected. This is not how they expected this would turn out. But there's also been a kind of closing of ranks. And so, Karen King is still employed, although she did begin a phased retirement at the earliest age allowed at Harvard. She began a phased retirement. She's not responded. Journalists have called her to request comment on the book. She's not responded to any of them. And I think her reputation has taken a hit. But people, her supporters will say, and this is true, she's had a track record of really great scholarship before this. But one of the things I focus on in the book, though, is that I think that the school of scholarship, the sort of the methodological underpinnings of her work made her especially vulnerable to a fake, or to being willing to overlook problems with the manuscript. She is an avowed postmodernist. She's not, she's a postmodern scholar. She doesn't believe that there is such a thing as objective truth, that whoever yells and tells the best story, creates truth for everybody else. It's a very fashionable theory. I remember studying it in college. And I think the idea is that, if you are not an empiricist, if you do not believe that there are facts out in the world that you can measure and test and describe, then you are not as concerned maybe with doing things like conducting scientific tests on your papyrus before announcing it in the New York Times and across the street from the Vatican. She did no scientific tests before announcing, not one. And so again, I think that her scholarship, her brilliance, Karen King is undoubtedly an extremely brilliant scholar, and her brilliance is her ability to interpret these very fragmentary texts that only survive in tiny pieces. She's great at connecting those dots, but she's not an archaeologist and she's not a scientist. And I think she has doubts about whether one can actually obtain facts about the world that are in any sense objective. And I think that perhaps, and I argue this towards the end of the book, that methodological approach made her vulnerable to a con artist whose story fit really well, whose story was more important than the truth, and I think that made her a target. I have no doubt that made her a mark for this con artist.
We have some questions in the chat which I'm about to read. I would just say it's like, what a shame, because she had such a great opportunity when she came out and said, I was wrong.
Yeah.
To then kind of come back and still talk about the importance of the work and of her essential theories. And
it is. It's a tragedy, and I think for exactly that reason, if you hit it on the head, Rabbi Mendelssohn, it's tragedy for precisely that reason, because she didn't need the papyrus to make the argument. She already had all the evidence she needed in Gospels like the Gospel of Mary, which is an authentic text, the Gospel of Philip, which is an authentic text. But this one went 10% further by suggesting there was a marriage. And again, if there's an authentic text suggesting that, great. Gospel of Philip, contrary to what the Da Vinci Code will tell you, does not suggest that they're married. It suggests they had a close spiritual bond. But that's different from earthly marriage. And so you're right. She had all the evidence she needed, and she could have done a mea culpa and sort of explained to the world how this happened, and then moved on. But instead, she's kind of gone underground.
So two questions. Just a couple of comments that, fantastic presentation, should be a great read. My colleague, Rabbi Bina Wing, asks, do you think that it being discounted as a forgery makes it virtually impossible going forward for the Catholic Church to see discoveries as having any kind of truth to them?
Wow, that's an excellent question. I mean, the Catholic Church, look, let's not pretend. The Catholic Church is also guilty of plenty of fictions. I think the Catholic Church does its own kind of postmodernism in the sense that it has a story, and then it seeks for facts that confirm the story. So in a weird way, there's like, it's happening on both sides, but for different reasons. And I think that, the Catholic Church, when it makes a discovery that, or evangelical Christians for that matter, I've written a lot about the Museum of the Bible here in Washington, D.C., and the evangelical billionaires behind Hobby Lobby who have amassed the largest private collection of biblical artifacts in the world. And they will tell you flat out, we've only collected artifacts that tell the story. In fact, Hobby Lobby, the Museum of the Bible, was offered a chance to purchase the Gospel of Judas. They said no, because it doesn't tell the story. It doesn't tell their story, the official story of Christianity that the evangelical Christians believe is the one true story. So I think the Catholic Church would act very much in the same way. If there's an archaeological discovery that affirms the Word of God as contained in the text of the canonical New Testament, then that is an affirmation of the scientific truth of the Bible. If it conflicts with that, then there's going to be a way. Then they'll explain it away. So I don't know that I think Catholics, and I went to an archaeological, so actually I visited for the Smithsonian Magazine. I wrote a story about the archaeological site at Magdala on the Sea of Galilee, the small town that Mary Magdalene was thought to have come from. This is a completely separate story. It's run by a Catholic order, and I interviewed the Catholic priest who runs it, and I said, well, what if okay, so yeah, the Bible, maybe Jesus met Mary Magdalene here, but what if you discover something that sort of upends that story? Do you fear that kind of discovery? And he said the Catholic Church doesn't fear anything. And so I think that gives you a sense of the way in which people with a strong desire to tell a particular story, whether it's a conservative evangelical, a traditional Catholic, or a progressive Christian, in the case of Karen King. Karen King, by the way, is a believer. She's not an atheist. She's a progressive believer. If you are someone who believes that the story is more important than the facts, then you will seek facts to tell the story rather than work the other way around. So I don't think it's ideal. I think it happens on both sides of the ideological spectrum.
Another question that Rabbi Wing asked was, what happened to the papyrus?
Yeah, that's a great story. It gets even weirder. In the paperback, which comes out in June, there's a postscript that will fill you in on that. So this is a way in which a falsehood, once introduced into the world, continues to reverberate long afterwards. We can look to our most recent election for evidence of the way in which falsehoods continue to reverberate. But so because the Smithsonian channel, which was not something I was part of, did a documentary on the Gospel of Jesus' wife in 2012 before anyone had any idea that it was fake. They did a documentary pretty much treating it as authentic. That documentary can be found on the internet, and it lives on the internet. You can find it. And a friend of an official in Egypt's Ministry of Antiquities saw it and told his friend at the Ministry of Antiquities. And Egypt is very aggressive about reclaiming anything that might have once been Egyptian. And so papyrus, material papyrus, old papyrus, almost invariably comes from Egypt. And the papyrus itself, the writing surface, is authentically old. It's not from the 2nd century, as King initially believed. It's actually medieval, which makes no sense. The content wouldn't work on a medieval fragment. So that's another problem with it. The content is very clearly, if it were authentic, it would have been 2nd to 4th century. It doesn't make sense that it would appear on 8th century. But the papyrus itself material is old, the blank scrap that the fake was written on. And so the Egypt's Antiquities Office made a request to the United States for all information about this papyrus. They saw it in like 2019. They finally found this documentary online. They weren't aware of what had come since. So they said, we'd love to learn more about it. So the Department of Homeland Security, which is responsible for investigating such requests or taking on such requests from foreign countries who believe that some of their cultural property might be abroad, they went to Walter Fritz and said, Egypt might be interested in this papyrus. And Walter Fritz was like, oh, yay. It was like for him, after it had already basically gone off into a ditch, he's like, oh, well, there's another there's someone else out there that might think this is authentic, or that I can convince people to think it might be authentic. So he permitted the Department of Homeland Security to go get it from Harvard and put it in there, some DHS storage facility somewhere. Now Egypt, when I finally reached the antiquities office at Egypt, I said, did you guys, so wait, did we get this whole thing wrong? Like, do you know that this came from some Egyptian larger codex? He's like, no, we have no idea. We don't know if it's fake or if it's real. We just saw something on the internet about it. And as we always do, we ask questions. We want to know what it is. So it's now in DHS property. Egypt has not to date requested its repatriation. I don't know where, I've checked recently, it still seems to be in DHS hands. And there's no indication that Egypt has asked for its return. I think Walter Fritz would love for it to be returned, because then he could claim, you see, now it's back in its homeland where it's belonged. Egypt wants to celebrate this part of its heritage. I talked to all the top scholars in Coptic and early Christian manuscripts that said, if Egypt asked for it back, that would make it no more authentic than it was before. There have been cases, including cases involving Egypt, where fakes have been repatriated. It happens. But to date, I don't think even Egypt has been convinced that it's authentic. They just asked questions. Walter Fritz was happy to have it seized from Harvard, which, by the way, now no one can look at it anymore, right? Now it's you can see pictures of it, but no one can do scientific studies of it anymore. So it's now somewhere in, like, I don't know if you guys remember the final scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark, where the Ark is in like a wooden crate and it's being wheeled deep into some government warehouse. I kind of think that's what's happened with the Gospel of Jesus' life. But I'm tracking it closely, and if and when there is more news, I will absolutely publicize it. But there is a brief update in the paperback version in the postscript, which comes out next month. Yeah.
Wow. Are there any more questions? Mark?
Yeah, if it's not too much of a spoiler, because I do want to read the book, so I don't need to know everything. But you said that was a medieval that was from medieval times, that manuscript. I mean, that's a pretty basic test.
Yeah. So the one of the tests that Karen King did not do, again, which everyone else does nowadays, you have carbon-14 testing, right? It's not that hard to do. You take a time, and Walter Fritz, the owner, he says yes to everything. He's very, very confident. Yeah, you want to take a little piece of, fine, no problem. So they took a piece of two papyri that Walter Fritz gave Karen King, both of which were later deemed to be forgeries. One was the Gospel of Jesus' wife. One was a fragment of the Gospel of John that had also been copied from an internet version of the Gospel of John, because it shared every single line break with it, which no text in antiquity does. But they went and they tested both of those papyrus fragments. They both dated to the 8th century, which is early Islamic Egypt. And it's also a time when the Coptic Church was fully Orthodox. So there would have been really you'd have to make a very good argument for why a Gnostic or quote unquote heretical Christian text would have been copied in 8th century early Islamic Egypt. And that was only discovered after the big pushback, after all this pushback, after her announcement in Rome. They did the testing, and then she tried to explain it away in her article. Actually, she waits till the very end of the article. It's the final line of her article in a quote postscript, where she says, "We recently received tests that show that the underlying papyrus is medieval, which would require some historical study to try to understand how this could be, basically." And the other problem was that the Gospel of John fragment was written in a dialect of Coptic that had died out in the 5th century AD, 300 years before the papyrus it was written on. So you find two fakes in possession of the same collector. The papyrus, the grammar's off, the handwriting's off, the carbon dating doesn't work. And the problem, and here's one of these things that, again, the tragedy is that if some of these tests had been done earlier, if the peer reviewers, 2 out of the 3 peer reviewers who looked at it before Karen King went public said, "We believe this is fake," they were ignored. And the one positive peer reviewer had helped Karen King write the article, which was a huge conflict of interest. And so the whole thing was it was just a bad couple of years for Harvard Divinity School. They do a lot of great scholarship. This just was not one of their finer moments. And I want to say too, the other thing I should say is that there are a lot of wonderful, wonderful feminist scholars of the Bible. There's a lot of wonderful, excellent scholarship on women's exclusion from biblical texts and from religious life. And that's all 100% authentic. If anyone uses the book to sort of mount an attack on feminist scholarship, they're deliberately misreading it, and that's not what it does. And I think what this is an example of a case where that excellent scholarship didn't happen. So just want to put that out there, and make sure that that's clear as well. This is not about feminist scholarship. It's about one particular case where Harvard Divinity School just refused to stop a train wreck before it happened.
So I before we end, I just wanted to ask you two more questions for you to answer
Sure.
briefly. But we were talking before the program started about your first book, a little bit about your first book, and I know it's something that would be really interesting to
Sure.
our folks. So would you just talk a little bit about your
Yeah.
first book and remind us of its title and tell us
Sure. Yeah. My first book, which my debut book, was called My Father's Paradise: A Son's Search for His Jewish Past in Kurdish Iraq. And this is the book that won the National Book Critics Circle Award for autobiography in 2009. And it was really, my father was born in an ancient community of Aramaic-speaking Jews in the mountains of Kurdish Iraq. Both of his parents were illiterate. This was a community that continued speaking Aramaic 1,200 years after the rest of the Middle East switched over to Arabic. They just didn't get the memo that we're doing Arabic now. They were so high up in the mountains that they continued speaking Aramaic. And I didn't really know any of this because by the time I was born and conscious, I was like in LA and a Jewish kid in Westwood in Los Angeles. My father was a professor of Near Eastern languages at UCLA. And someone who had basically spent his entire academic career trying to formally document his own dying mother tongue, Aramaic, which had been not only the language of Jesus, but the 3,000-year-old language that was the lingua franca of much of the Middle East for 1,000 years at least. And so this is a story. My Father's Paradise is a story of kind of the all-American son's journey to retrace his own family's heritage from this faraway ancient past in the mountains of Kurdistan. It's also a story about a father and son's reconciliation, but it's also a story of reconciliation between the ancient world and the very modern one. I mean, you can imagine like my father, being born up, near the Turkish border of Iraq in the mountains, and then his son, playing drums in a rock band and skateboarding and boogie boarding in Los Angeles. I mean, these are worlds apart. And so I had to spend a book and a lot of, agita, trying to figure out how these two worlds connected. And that's what My Father's Paradise is, that first book.
Thank you. I will send the link to that too when I send out the link for this talk. And then could you just tell us what you're working on now?
Yeah, I continue, I guess, this theme that we've been talking about, the way in which the ancient world continues to reverberate in our own modern one, whether it's, whether it's the stories of our past that continue to inform the way we live today, or the way in which various political actors, whether they're evangelical Christians or progressives, will weaponize the past, will take stories from the past to try to make an argument about the present. And that continues to fascinate me. Why are we reaching back to the classics? Why are we reaching back to the Bible to make arguments that one can make very modern ethical arguments for? Why is there still this sense of having to root our morality in some very ancient ideas rather than in our own present moment? I don't have the answers to that. I just love asking really smart people that question and writing stories that sort of get at those questions. So my latest story is another piece for the Atlantic. I'm not allowed to say too much more about it, but it again deals with antiquities again, ancient artifacts that have been misused in some way. So hopefully you'll read that in the Atlantic in the fall sometime.
So Ariel, I just want to thank you so much for your time. This was completely fascinating. And I want to remind everyone that the name of the book is Veritas, a Harvard professor, a con man, and the Gospel of Jesus's wife. I will send out a link to this talk so that you can forward it to friends, and that will also include, my email will also include a link to buy Ariel's book. Of course, we hope that you'll buy it from your local bookstore. For those of us in Port Washington, we can ask the Dolphin to order a couple of copies for us, if you don't mind, instead of ordering it from Amazon. Ariel, thank you again. This has been fantastic. So much food for thought. Everyone, I hope you enjoy this beautiful sunshiny day, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. That's the end of our program, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks, everyone.